be the sort of master of ceremonies this evening. For those of you that don't know the book, haven't had a chance to read it yet, perhaps I might just sketch it, because it's a very unusual and remarkable piece of work, a challenging piece of work, which takes in many different genres and many different narrative events, and indeed sort of the structure is rather complex in lots of ways. It's a book essentially about some of the characters and the situations that informed the rise of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. So the book opens a rather spectacular opening scene set on a holiday in Kyrgyzstan on the 9th of September 2001. So from the very beginning of the narrative, we're plunged into the events of the so-called War on Terror. And then the book moves backwards and forwards in time, telling essentially the story of post-Soviet Uzbekistan, the story of the rise in the Fergana Valley of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, and the story principally of three individuals, of Tahir Yuldash, the intellectual leader, if you like, of the IMU, of Juma Namagani, the military leader of the IMU, and a third character that Hamid will tell us about, who happens to be the hero of the book, the eponymous poet in the title, A Poet and Bin-Laden, and that is Belgi. And Belgi is a young Sufi poet growing up in Osh in the early parts of the book. In the 1990s, we follow his interface, his relationship, his engagement with the repressive regime in Uzbekistan and with those people in Fergana and elsewhere who are trying to change the situation. And as the story moves through, for those of you who aren't familiar with recent Uzbek history, it can be a little daunting at first, but essentially the milestones in the narrative would be the rise of the IMU, running up through perhaps to the bombings in Tashkent in 1999, then the Batken insurgency of the following year, and then of course you get then into 2001. And what happens in the core of the book is that Belgi, from being a sort of transcendental literary figure on the outside of the political militant movement, is drawn irrevocably and inexorably more and more into the centre of it. There's a kind of dialectic, if you like, in the book between different sorts of response to oppression, different sorts of response to war and to poverty and to difficulty. And one response is the intellectual, literary, transcendental response, the Sufi response in some ways. And the other response, of course, is a more direct and immediate and violent response, which is the response of the militants who took up arms and fought in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, and in Afghanistan. So it's a very challenging book in lots of ways. In my view, what was so extraordinary for me when I first read it was that I was a journalist that was actually covering a lot of these events. In an earlier draft, there are some transcripts of Agence France Presse stories covering the Batken insurgency, which I think I wrote. So I think I wrote some of these, but they were edited out at a later stage. But what's extraordinary about the book is that it takes this very real political contemporary movement, which may in the 1990s have seemed slightly esoteric and arcane to a lot of us, but of course after 9/11 it became very much the centre of all our lives. And the movement of the book is very wonderful because it tells this story. It also discloses a lot of very primary bits of information, sources. Hamid Ismailov knows more about the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan than many journalists. Has met Tahir Yuldash, met them and Namangani. So at the same time as being an extraordinary account of this political narrative, it actually contributes to it in some ways. And of course it's also a work of the imagination, it's a work of art. And the final thing that I would say is that the extraordinary thing about that dialectic, and it's also contained in the little tale that there is at the end, the tale of the last of the great Mughals, the tale of Aurangzeb and his brother Dara Shukor, two different responses to a revolutionary moment. The response of the Sufi, the poet, the transcendentalist, and the response of the fundamentalist. So that's very much a sort of sketch of the the book as I see it. But perhaps we might ask Hamid to tell us something about what it was that compelled him to write this book.
So the beginning of this book, the idea of this book came to me in one of the Greek restaurants near Sadler's Wells, I think, where me, publisher Christopher Marklehouse, and Razia, my wife, were sitting and discussing my first book, The Railway, which he wanted to publish, which was translated by Robert Chandler, who is here as well. Yes, and we were discussing the sort of, approaches how to publish The Railway, and thinking or talking about The Railway, Christopher asked me, what are you working on now? And I said to him that I'm working on a novel which is called Ton Juan, which is sort of about Soviet sexuality, about football, and so on and so forth. He wasn't interested at all in this Soviet sexuality and the rest of it, but he said, are you planning to go to Afghanistan now? And I said, yes, I'm planning to go to Afghanistan. It was year 2000. And he started to ask me more and more about the sort of my trip, where I was going, what I'm going to do there, and I was going on the invitation of Taliban, of the leaders of the Taliban, which wanted to, in a way, show themselves to the outer world. And they found me somehow because I was sort of covering the issues in the Central Asia, and they invited me to see, as a Western journalist, what Taliban is up to. And all of a sudden he said, why you don't write this book, about Taliban, about what happens in Central Asia? So he was the initial, or the person who initiated this novel. And in the very beginning of this novel, I dedicated to him because he gave the idea of this book. So I wrote it and finished in 2004, I think. Immediately, in 2004. And the Russian version of it was published in 2006. And now we've got the English version.
It's very interesting, that idea of the Taliban coming to you as a media worker, as a journalist, and wanting to show you what they were doing in Central Asia and perhaps in Afghanistan, because one thing that's very apparent in the book is the interest that Tahir Yildiz and Namangali took in media coverage. And for those who haven't read the book, Hamid actually incorporates media products, articles, bits of outtakes from news, bits of the wire agencies. They're embedded in the narrative. So there's this very interesting kind of formal quality that the book has. And on the front of it, the cover, I noticed that, Hamid, you've called the book a reality novel. So perhaps you could tell us something about what that means.
About the reality novel. So there is a funny sort of relationship between sort of writership and journalism in our family. Sometimes my wife says to me that, if she wants to downgrade me, she says, journalist rather than a writer. So I decided to play with these two notions, what is the journalism about, what is the writership about, and to the extent that I started to probe this reality, to the very extremes, Generally, I wanted to write a fictional book which will be full of the documents, and you never know which part is the document and which part is the fiction. So that was my sort of, artistic challenge in a way. And therefore, by the end, I decided to call it a reality novel. I'll give you an example. One of the main characters of this novel is a fictional character. But when the Russian version of this book was published, one of the well-wishers passed the book on to the Uzbek authorities. And it ended up apparently with the security services. And then a an academic who is closely sort of associated with those security services came to give a lecture here. And he asked me about this book. I said, yes, I know this book, and so because I published it under the pen name. The author was mistaken, he said, because this character, on the first night when he met Tahir Yildiz, he has been beaten up.
And he didn't exist.
He didn't exist. He didn't exist. But security services established this character. So, which shows that I was quite successful in, making this reality novel.
So it's a kind of sort of mind games that are played in the world of the security services and the sort of Le Carré-esque kind of landscape, if you like, where it's hard to work out where the dividing line between, if all the spooks are reading the articles about themselves and inviting the journalist to, it's very difficult actually to get a sense of what is real and what is not real. Is that the point that you're trying to make in a way, that it's very difficult to actually draw those lines and to make those stark distinctions between fiction and reality? Is that part of what?
Yes, and partly, it was a challenge, sort of artistic, as I'm saying, challenge, because generally, as a writer, I see that, non-fiction is gaining over the fiction now, more and more. People, they want to read what you've seen yourself, and what you've lived through yourself, rather than someone's sort of, thoughts or opinions or sort of, scenes, landscapes, and so on and so forth. So I'm jealous as a writer, I'm jealous as a writer, and therefore I decided to explode the sort of, the so-called journalistic work, or non-fictional work from inside, to bring there the literature. So basically it was fiction of the documentary, or the documentary of the fiction, where you are sort of, in a way, I don't want to say fooling, but generally you are replacing one with another. And that was the artistic challenge of this book.
And the main character, Belgi, you talked about yourself as a writer, a journalistic writer, that's your day job with the BBC, but a poet and a novelist also. So as an Uzbek writer, you had engaged with, you couldn't avoid engaging with, you'd had to leave Uzbekistan for kind of political reasons earlier on in your career. Were your experiences as a writer, did they inform the experiences that you represent as being Belgi's experiences as a writer in the book? Is there a kind of, what was important about Belgi as a persona, as a character? What were you trying to convey by using him as this kind of iconic figure at the centre of the book?
I think there are many similarities here. There are many similarities in the sort of, approach to the world, in the, openness to the world, I would say, because Belgi as a poet, he's not a person who accepts the sort of, given truths, whichever they are. Whether they are sort of, the contemporary Uzbek authorities one, or their opposites, Islamic movement of Uzbekistan ones. He probes everything for himself. That is very important for me. He approaches to everything as a poet who tries to touch the reality, and feel it for himself. There is a famous saying, just to make my life easier, there is a famous saying of Heine, that if the world cracks into two parts, so the crack will lie through the heart of the poet. So therefore, he was very, very dear for me as a sort of character and as the protagonist of what's happening there.
And the other protagonist in the title of the book, there's this very memorable chapter in the book where Belgi, having been recruited into the IMU and then into the Taliban, is taken into Afghanistan, and at night in a jeep, not entirely clear where it is that he's going, he's taken to a grand house where he is introduced into the company of Osama bin Laden. So there's this extraordinary scene towards the end of the book where the poet and bin Laden meet. And could you tell us something about the importance of that meeting, of that encounter, what the poet and the terrorist? What's the importance of their interface?
What's interesting here for me personally, that, you know, unfortunately the world of the last 20, 30 years all of a sudden became sort of black and white. Either you are with us or you are against us. So that was the sort of, you know, the quality which was brought to this world by, on one side by people like Bin Laden, on the other side by people like Bush, yeah? So black and white world. Whereas for me, on both sides, people still live colorful lives. What I'm saying, colorful lives, not black and white lives, you know. Very often here, for example, in the West, we accept Islam as a sort of monolith and as a sort of, you know, one thing which you should be afraid of. By the way, one of the, you know, first title of this book, when I was discussing it with our great friend Anne-Marie Schimmel, was she suggested the title, Islam that you fear and I don't. So I wanted to show that even among the terrorists, there are people who are sort of still thinking what's good, what's right, what's wrong, what is this world about. It's not just the sort of, you know, zombie mass. That was very important for me, and therefore a poet, he should have played this role more than anyone else.
And that idea of being among the terrorists, that's a very good sort of link actually to, we're going to hear a little bit of a reading from the book. And perhaps you would just sort of introduce the reading that we're going to hear. After he's been recruited into the IMU, he gets caught up in the Afghan war and finds himself incarcerated because clearly he's in northern Afghanistan and he's captured by General Dostum's men, and he finds himself in Sheberghan prison, which is sort of, you know, the tabloid take on that is it's the kind of Afghan Guantanamo, if you like. And there's a scene that we're going to hear an extract from of Belgi very much among the terrorists in that prison. Do you want to say a few words about it? Or was
I think we'll better play, yeah.
Cold yard of the prison. The latches grated shut behind them. The night was clear and piercingly cold. His legs were unused to walking, and his knees trembled, and the trembling kept rising higher up his body. The Uzbek shoved him into the back of the jeep, where two of Dostum's armed men were already sitting. The barrels of their automatic rifles glinted coldly in the black night. The doors of the cab slammed shut and they drove out of the yard. Behind them he could still hear the shouts of Allahu Akbar. They drove through Sheberghan, past the clay buildings, pale in the night, and Yosef caught himself thinking how banal death could be. An unreal night trick that might have surfaced out of a childhood dream. The body of one of the soldiers involuntarily swayed against him as they drove over the potholes that were softened by the moonlight, and the contact warmed them both, although the body of the man sitting opposite them was sullen, with the rifle gripped between the knees. They drove out of the town. I ought to look at the stars, Yosef thought, and then stopped himself short. What for? A girl had once told him in a
feeling of the, you have a flavor of his poetry. The book is full of his poetry, but just one poem. Xudo urganmi, unutgan bir olmon qishlog'ida bozor kuni, to'g'rirog'i dam olish kuni, poyezd kutar ekanman. Bahor quyoshi ostida, endi uyg'ongan qurbaqam chumolidek, erinchoq fikrlarim ketidan ohista yurardim. Bo'sh ko'cha, bo'sh maktab, maktab hovlisi, to'r osilgan ikki futbol darvoza, ketida mo'ylovi sabzi urgandek, maysasi nish urgan tanish bir do'nglik. Ko'chaning ikkinchi tomoni chakalak tollar oralab tepaga ketgan zinaning yer bosgan, o't bosgan qoldiqlari. U ham bir narsani esga solgandek, bir narsaga ishora qilgudek. u ham. Tepadan qarasang ikki yon jarda shisha siniqlari, bo'kib qurigan qog'ozlar, shabboda. Quyosh ham qog'oz bulutlar oralab yurgan shamoldek, istasa kezadi, istasa taqqa to'xtaydi. Tom keraksizlik. Yurgan yo'llaringda mixmi ilgaklar, zanglagan qopqoqlar, vaqt turshaklari, tosh yo'lak, temir yo'l, ora-chura o't, tirik boychechakmi, oddiy simmi yo aslida bularning bari fikrni undarkan avvalroq vahming anglaydi. Sening ham hayoting balki tom keraksizliklar ularga uyg'un. Aslida sen bunga kuyukma asta. O'limning aslida yo'q baland pasti. Zotan o'lim emas, o'lim tomon yo'l, o'limning o'zidan ortiqroq hayot.
That's fine. Yeah. Just hearing the Uzbek and the English together made me think that perhaps we should just at this point celebrate the translators who brought this book to fruition. So the prose, the narrative, has been translated by the acclaimed translator Andrew Brumfield, and I think the poems were translated really with you and Richard McCain. Is that right?
Yeah,
so it's a lot of hands have gone to. A lot of work's being collaborations want to put this thing together. I think we're going to possibly have some questions now. Something, if anyone's got any questions from the floor to ask Hamid something. I'm going to have the first week.
Yes, please.
It's probably not relevant to what in terms of I haven't read the book yet, but I'm just curious. The Bin-Laden is in capital letters, or like in large font than the poet. Is there any reason behind it, why Bin-Laden is in capital letters and in bigger font rather than poet, for example? I thought there was some meaning.
I have to ask the publisher. Because you know, I didn't take part in any sense in the sort of, you know, designing the book. Yeah, I'm sorry, but yeah, the publisher can explain, or maybe the designer of the book can explain why Bin-Laden, maybe because of his stature.
Hamid, you mentioned that your book was first published in Russian, right, in 2006. Is it still available?
It is available. It was published. I tried very hard to find, a publisher in Russia, but unfortunately, many people they wanted, but they were a bit afraid of publishing this book in Russian in Russia because at that time Chechnya was still going on. So they were quite nervous about this book, and then a publisher here, Lena Chibar, the publisher of Black Quadrat, decided to publish this book, and she single-handedly published it. Yeah, she had some calls from the Uzbek embassies and so on and so forth. But yeah.
I mean, just a question about language, but about Russian really, in terms of the post-Soviet story of the whole region. I mean, how does it feel writing in Russian in terms of this much larger history and the many new countries, or the countries revived outside of the Soviet process? I mean, is there a kind of issue there around language and the stories that can be told within Russian in terms of the history that we now find ourselves in?
With the hindsight, I would have preferred to write it in Uzbek. But unfortunately, if you write in Uzbek, I write in Uzbek, and I just finished a novel which I published on the Facebook. I write in Uzbek. Every second year I write in Uzbek, basically. One book in Russian, one book in Uzbek. The problem with Uzbek, unfortunately, nobody reads it. That is the biggest problem, That is the biggest problem. In Russian, you still can hope that someone can read it, will read it. And then the issue of translation as well, because I was discussing this book from the very beginning with the publisher, with Christopher McLehos, yes, I was thinking about the translation as well. I wouldn't yeah, I'll tell you straightforward that I was thinking about the English version of this book as well. Nobody translates from Uzbek. Unfortunately, I've got tons of books in Uzbek, nobody translates them.
This idea, Hamid, mixing with the reality with fiction, how dangerous do you think that is in terms of, for example, would it confuse the reader? Some writers have done that. For example, Bret Easton Ellis, he wrote about himself and then he wouldn't make it clear how much of it was fiction, how much of it was reality, and then everyone felt sort of confused. But in this sense, it's such a serious topic. Do you think it would confuse the readers if they wanted to say research this issue?
I didn't cross some of the borders, I didn't cross the borders where it's sort of, I'm fooling people or joking, or I didn't cross these borders. Generally, it's a truthful book, it's a truthful work. But at the same time, as I'm saying, I always think, for example, once I went to Jaslik prison, just to talk to people there, and I could have done straightforward journalistic piece on that one. But somehow, something was missing there. And I wrote a novella about that. And I'm constantly thinking why I wrote the novella rather than just putting it straightforward, I went, I saw, and so on and so forth. There is something in the nature of fiction or nature of prose which is more truthful than the reality itself. And that is the point why, for example, we are writing fiction. Why generally fiction is existing. I think because it allows, to be more real than the reality. So that would be my answer. And fiction, which is in this book, just helps this reality to get a shape. Yes, please.
There are lots of wonderful poems which Belgi has written in this book. Were you writing them, or were you writing them as him, or?
No. He is published. You see, he's published.
Right.
Yes. I was just using this book.
He's not the fictitious one.
I was just using this book.
It's a very enigmatic book in lots of ways. People will leave it at that.
Yeah.
Just perhaps on the music, just because we heard that lovely piece of music from Razi, and we also heard the Belgi, his poetic work. So he's thrown into the middle of this kind of historical whirlwind, and yet, rather like the character in The Railway, he's very full of the Uzbek past, Uzbek folklore. His poetry is very elusive, it's very lyrical. Would those pieces, the Dutar music, would they be the pieces of music that we heard just now? Would they be the kind of music that Belgi would have been listening to, or would have meant something to him? What would the relationship between Belgi and the piece of music that we heard this evening be?
I think he would have been brought up by this music, one thing, and secondly, because the second part of this book is the piece about the court of great Moguls. So in the court of great Moguls, this kind of music would have been played nearly every day. And Razia told about the female part of the music. Generally, the court of great Moguls was very much feminine as well. The people like Zebunisa, a poet Zebunisa, and many others, they were very prominent there. And therefore they would have played this music, they would have listened to this music. Yes. It would have been part of their life.
Right. Any other questions?
If not, wine is waiting for you.
And you're going to sign some books as well.
Yes.
That's it. Yes. Books are next door, and there's one last.
Yeah.
I just wonder about, because obviously you read this book a while ago now, and if you were to write it now, what you changed, or maybe you did make some changes when you came to the English edition. I don't know.
Very much so. Yes, the English edition is very different to the Russian one. Quite different to the Russian one. Yes. It's crispier, it's clearer, it's different book. It's a different.
Did you take out whole chapters? Or?
Yeah, many chapters as well. Yes.
And also, it's written in the light of events which succeed, such as Andijan in 2005, for instance. I mean, you put it in you've updated the context that the reader can
yes,
encounter.
that's true. Yeah,
so are you happier with this book than with the?
I think so. I think so.
Why did it take 6 years to translate the English one?
It took some time to translate it, and the general situation with publishing is quite difficult now because of the crisis in the world, economic crises in the world, and many people here, they are facing the same, I think, with the publishing industry. But I was lucky to meet Maxim, and he decided that he is ready to publish this book, and he decided to publish it, and it was quite quick.
I think on that note, because the project, the Glagoslav project, the English are very bad at reading literatures in translation. We're far too insular. I think that we should all make a point of trying to support Maxim in his project of getting these works of modern Russian, Ukrainian and Belarusian literature into English translation. That's what
yes,
so
one of the books which I would immediately recommend is a book of my friend, Alexander Terekhov, which is Stone Bridge. A wonderful book, a wonderful book. If you see it, so please buy it.
Excellent. I think on that note, plugging somebody else's book, let's finish. Thank you very much.